Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the first of the 3 recordings that we're going to have about the 1920s. I hope everybody is doing really well and managing the course content, both the recordings and the regular sort of text-based PowerPoints on Blackboard. Be sure that if you've got any questions about anything, you let me know as soon as possible so that I can give you some advice and some guidance and suggestions on that. This is going to be a really interesting topic, or at least it is for me, because it's one of those decades that sort of exists in the popular imagination in a particular way, but that's not necessarily the way things actually were at the time. And I think it's really important when we have those kinds of inconsistencies or sort of popular memories about things that we actually understand the reality of what was going on, and not just kind of perpetuate these stereotypes and that kind of thing. And so the sort of common treatment or perception of the 1920s is in many ways kind of based on writings by people like F. Scott Fitzgerald. So if you've read The Great Gatsby at any point in high school or in college, it's a really common book to appear in reading lists, in American Lit in both high school and college. That gives you a sense of what a lot of people imagine the 1920s to be, right? With lots of jazz music and people in tuxedos and lots of dancing and people drinking champagne and cocktails and, all that kind of thing. And that certainly was part of it, but that was absolutely not the majority of experiences throughout the country, because that was a very particular kind of generation, a very particular kind of socioeconomic group that Fitzgerald was describing. And the reality was a lot different, and the reality included a lot of very deep and profound tensions between different classes in American society. Lots of tension in terms of gender relations, lots of tensions regarding a kind of generation gap between old and young, between urban and rural populations, lots and lots of things going on here. And so we're going to get into a number of those different kinds of, I guess, sort of dichotomies, right? Those one side versus the other side kinds of situations that existed in the 1920s. Because it's really an essential way to understand what's happening at the time. So the 1920s kicks off, in some respects, with the end of World War I in 1918. There is a brief economic kind of dip in 1919, 1920 that the United States manages to pull out of pretty easily, mainly because the US isn't affected by the war in the same way that countries in Europe are, especially places like Germany or France or Britain or Belgium, right? Those countries are devastated in terms of their population, in terms of their economies. The United States, for a number of different reasons, is not affected in the same degree by the First World War. There is, though, the Spanish flu. Excuse me, the Spanish flu spreads out of Spain as near as people could tell, and excuse me, and makes its way into Europe, makes its way into North America, manages to spread into Africa, Asia, etc. The impact in some of those places is a little bit harder to gauge, just because of poor record keeping and that sort of thing. In the countries that we do have good records for, especially Europe and North America, it's a devastating pandemic, right? Tens of millions of people are killed. Estimates vary. Some of them go all the way upwards of 100 million or more people die as a result of the Spanish flu over a fairly short period of time. It's maybe 14 months at the most. The United States, again, is certainly struck with the flu, but not to the same degree that we can see in parts of Europe or other parts of the world. So even with that, though, the United States sees a death rate of about 500,000 to 750,000 people, again, in the span of a very short time. And so this puts a lot of strain on social services, on public health services, and those kinds of things that are going to sort of shock the system in a lot of ways. But it doesn't have a significant long-term consequence for the economy. It doesn't have a significant long-term consequence for politics or society. It is a tragedy that strikes and disappears within a fairly short time, historically speaking. So what kinds of things were going on in the 1920s to really sort of define the decade? Well, what we're going to focus on in this particular section is politics, and then we'll get into society, and then we'll get into some issues with economics and leisure culture and things like that later. But this one's going to be about politics, and the decade is really defined by a pretty substantial dominance by the Republican Party. And partially this is because people who were voting in the 1920s were deliberately avoiding the kinds of political figures that they had had in the first 20 years of the 1900s. So you had people like Teddy Roosevelt, you had people like Woodrow Wilson, right? Between the two of them, they were in charge for 8 of the first 16 of the first 20 years of the century. Sorry, my math wasn't really working with me there. So those people were boisterous in the case of Roosevelt, very bombastic, very larger than life, or in the case of Wilson, very intense, very moralistic, very sort of focused in that respect. And the American voting public decided, we don't really want that now, because we feel that those people took the country in a particular direction that isn't exactly what we want at this point. And so the first Republican president of the 1920s is a man named Warren Harding. And Harding comes from Ohio. He was a lieutenant governor of Ohio. He served as a U.S. senator from Ohio. Harding is usually ranked in the bottom 10 or so of American presidents, right? He is not very decisive. He's not very active. He was exactly what Americans wanted at the time, which is an easygoing, low-key, sort of unobtrusive person in the White House who wasn't going to make any dramatic promises or take the country in any kind of a dramatic direction. And so he wins election pretty easily. He hasn't made any enemies by making tough decisions or taking a stand on tough issues. And so it's a fairly boring presidency from a policy standpoint, right? Whether you're looking at domestic policy or foreign policy. He is responsible for installing a handful of cabinet officials who are going to have significant impacts in America in sort of different ways, though. One of them is his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Andrew Mellon. And that's Mellon there. He looks kind of like Skeletor. Mellon is very pro-business. He is an advocate of a laissez-faire economy, right? Which is basically French for hands off. Basically, this means that the government should not get involved in economic regulation or economic oversight, that it is the responsibility of the corporate world itself to manage its own affairs, right? That if left to its own devices, the economy will find its own kind of equilibrium. Everybody will be able to sort of benefit from the fruits of a free market. And so he works very hard to limit the kinds of existing government regulatory agencies so that they don't, from his perspective, interfere in the sort of smooth operation of the economy. He is an advocate of what's known as supply-side economics, which, if you've heard the term trickle-down economics, it's the same idea, that if you reduce the taxes on the wealthy, that money will eventually, the money that the wealthy save by not paying taxes, will end up being invested in the stock market, or it will end up being invested in the businesses that those wealthy people own. And over time, that money will find its way down through the system into the pockets of the average person. People hold very different beliefs on whether trickle-down economics works, whether it's a viable economic idea. It is still something that is hotly debated in America today. Mellon isn't the originator of the idea, but he certainly is an early vocal advocate for that approach. So Mellon is on the side of, whether you agree or disagree with his policies, he is very much a significant figure in politics in the 1920s. He will be Secretary of the Treasury really throughout the entire decade, for Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, right? The three presidents of the 1920s. On the other hand, Harding installs a Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Albert Fall, who gets wrapped up in one of the biggest scandals really in American political history, called the Teapot Dome scandal. And the Teapot Dome scandal is a little bit complicated to explain. Basically, what's happening here is the US government owns land, right, all around the country. Most famously, the land that the government owns is national parks and national forests and national monuments and that kind of thing. So those are the obvious things. But the government also owns land that is used for strategic purposes. And some of that land includes land that is sort of on top of large deposits of oil or other natural resources, right? Essential natural resources. In the 1920s, Albert Fall decides to take some of the land that was under the control of the US Navy that had oil, that the Navy held as basically a backup plan, right? Worst case scenario, the country is in a situation where it can't get enough oil. The Navy's warships aren't going to have basically fuel to operate. And they then would tap into the strategic reserves that they own, that the Navy Department owns around the country. Well, Albert Fall takes this land away from the Department of the Navy, puts it under his control in the Department of the Interior, all so that he can open that land up to oil speculation and then get kickbacks and money and gifts and things from that. Hopefully that all made sense. It's, like I said, it's a complicated kind of arrangement. If you've got questions about Teapot Dome, please make sure to let me know, and I will, of course, do my best to clarify that. So this is a significant crisis for the Harding administration because Albert Fall ends up being taken to court for criminal prosecution for this. It drags the Harding administration through the mud. It appears, though, that Harding is not personally involved in this scandal. There are other scandals that happened during Harding's presidency, too. We won't go into those in much detail, but his presidency is really tarnished by a lot of these different kinds of improper behaviors. Some of them are more minor than others, but it's all happening on his watch. And so in some respects, Harding's reputation is poor partially because of his inability to keep a close watch on his subordinates. Partially it's due to the fact that he's not a very active president. He just kind of sits in the Oval Office and lets the country kind of run on its own. So Harding dies in office of natural causes. He dies August 2nd, 1923. He's a widely beloved president at the time, because, again, he's not directly connected with any of the scandals that the public knows about, and the things that the public doesn't know about obviously can't possibly hurt him, right, reputation-wise. So he dies, and his vice president takes office, a man named Calvin Coolidge. And as sort of boring as Harding was, Coolidge is, if anything, even more boring. He is a very powerful advocate of laissez-faire, right? This kind of hands-off free market economy. So he continues that approach that Harding and Mellon have begun. He keeps Mellon and some others of Harding's cabinet in their positions. So he's not really doing much to put his own stamp on the presidency. He wins the nomination to be Harding's running mate largely because he gets a lot of national publicity for the way he handles a strike by the Boston Police Department. He is governor of Massachusetts at the time. The Boston Police, right before the 1920 election, the Boston Police go on strike, and Harding really cracks down on this. He says, police officers cannot go on strike because that puts the lives of the population, right, citizens at risk, puts their safety at risk, and so he says you can't use a strike as a method of kind of holding the public and holding the government hostage. So even though this is happening just in Boston, it makes national headlines. Coolidge gets a lot of positive publicity. Remember, this is still a time when organized labor is not looked at very sort of positively by the American public, and so he's going to win a lot of points that way. And so the Republican Party looks at that and they say, you know what, this is the kind of guy that we want to be a nominee for Harding's vice president. Harding then dies just about a year before the 24 election. Coolidge finishes that election cycle. He finishes Harding's term. He wins election on his own in the election of 1924. And then he just gives up, right? He basically says, I'm not going to run for president again, even though he could have if he had wanted. He just quits. He just walks away. And Coolidge then gives way to another president whose reputation is fairly complicated, and that is Herbert Hoover. And that's Hoover's picture on the left. He had probably one of the most thorough, the most extensive resumes of any president in American history. He had served in private industry. He was an engineer by trade and had made millions of dollars in the mining industry. So he was wealthy. He was a public servant in World War I, where he initially starts out leading the sort of private relief effort known as Belgian Relief. So he gets national notice from that. He then gets drafted into Wilson's administration as being the head of what's called the Food Administration, which is an agency in the government that's designed to help with food rationing and making sure that people in the country get enough food while there is still enough food distributed into the military. He then is tapped by Harding to be Commerce Secretary in the cabinet. So he has a wide range of public service experience. He has a range of private experience. So definitely a very well-qualified individual to sort of serve as president. He he runs up against a Democrat from New York named Al Smith. Smith was governor of New York. He was Catholic, which in the 1920s was a serious concern for a lot of Americans. The worry at the time was, well, if you're Catholic and you quote-unquote take your orders from the Pope, where do your loyalties lie, right? If the Pope establishes a certain position that Catholics have to follow, will a Catholic president follow the Pope's instructions, or will a Catholic president follow the expectations of the American people or Congress or that kind of thing, right? So this is a significant part of the election of 1928 as well. They're also different in a number of other ways, right? Hoover is very restrained, he's very buttoned up. The picture on the left is his presidential portrait, but that's kind of the way he would look all the time, right? He would wake up in the middle of the night and need to go to the bathroom, and that's what he would put on, practically. So Hoover is very restrained, he is popular with Eastern businessmen. He is a dry candidate, which means that even though he was not personally a teetotaler, right, he drank, but he believed that since Prohibition was the law of the land, that was the law, and he was going to support it. Smith, on the other hand, the guy on the right, was a wet. Basically, that means he supported the ending of Prohibition. He wasn't terribly active in enforcing Prohibition law. And so they represented very different kinds of perspectives. Smith was a machine politician. He was an urbanite at a time when that was not necessarily an advantage. So Hoover wins a fairly easy victory. And you can see on the map, the blue states go for Hoover, the red states go for Smith. So Hoover wins, 80% of the electoral vote, almost 60% of the popular vote. And Hoover even wins some states in the South that traditionally would go Democratic, right? Places like Texas and Florida and Carolina and Virginia and so on. But what this map doesn't really show is something that will come back to haunt the Republican Party in the next election in 1932, and that is there are a lot of people scattered in those blue states that were not entirely happy with the way the Republican Party was doing things, and were beginning to either vote Democrat or were kind of leaning in that direction. What that means is, when Roosevelt runs for election in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, he is going to win the biggest landslide in American history up to that point, largely because of support from urban populations and the farm population, right, the agricultural sector. And so Hoover manages a fairly easy path to the presidency in 1928, but that's kind of hiding some deeper fractures and splits within the voting population. And those are going to actually be sort of revealed when we come to the election of 1932. So that's some of the background for what's going on politically in the 1920s. If you've got questions about any of that, please be sure to let me know. Our next session then, the next recording, is going to talk about the kinds of social tensions that are taking place, where you have issues with immigration, you have issues over urban versus rural, you have issues over kind of modern versus tradition, and that kind of thing. And so those are going to be some really essential points of disagreement, points of tension that exist within the United States during the 1920s. Some of them are things that have carried down all the way to the present even, right? And you can still see remnants of some of this all the way down to today. So I hope everyone's doing really, really well. I will see everybody again when we get into the next topic. And again, make sure that if you've got questions, you let me know as soon as possible so that I can help you get answers to those. So take care.